You have 45 minutes.
Thank you, Judge. On January 25th, year 2012, in an alley in the city of Detroit, the police found the body of Jane Bashara, dumped at the police. Judge, we're having a-
I'm sorry, Miss Lindsay.
This is coming in.
We can't, the machine. Can you start all over?
Yes.
And a little louder?
Yes, okay.
Wait a minute. Oh, go ahead.
On January 25th, in the year of 2012, the police found the body of Jane Bashara dumped in an alley in the city of Detroit like a piece of common trash. The very next day, the defendant, Robert Bashara, started his public grieving at a candlelight vigil for his wife. An outpouring of the community came to support him as he said at that vigil how devastated he was about what happened to his wife. And he continued his public grieving when he went on the airwaves to talk about what he thought about the crime, what he thought happened, and how he felt the love and affection he had for his wife.
I have no clue. I have no idea what happened.
Bob Bashara is speaking out for the first time about the murder of his wife, Jane.
I've lost my girlfriend and my partner, and it's absolutely just unthinkable.
But
I lost my girlfriend. I lost my partner. It's unthinkable. Just unthinkable. And I have no clue at all what happened. But that didn't stop him from saying various things about what he thought, separated from himself, what he thought happened to her.
Any reason that she would be over in that part of town in Detroit?
No, none whatsoever. I don't believe she went there. I believe that that she was out running an errand and doing something, and someone had carjacked her or kidnapped her or did something like that. I have no reason to believe she would be at 7th and Hoover for any reason.
Jane Bashara, very sad story. We've heard it before. Urban or suburban mother, the victim of random street violence. Some thug must have kidnapped her, carjacked her. This poor woman who lives in the suburbs somehow got in the city of Detroit, and that's what happened to her. The defendant even, and you notice that, when you talk about that, that directs the attention away from the defendant. The focus is away from the defendant when he starts talking about urban violence. You're also going to even hear at some point, there was another murder that was getting a lot of press during that time. It's called the Backpage murders. 4 women who had been abandoned in trunks. You're going to hear he went on TV talking about the Backpage murders. You're going to hear when he talked to the police, he suggested, did my poor wife's murder have anything to do with those 4 poor women found abandoned in trunks? Directing attention away from himself. You're even going to hear that when he talked to the police, and I want to get the language right, he told the police, you know, I don't want to narc on my poor wife, but my wife smoked marijuana, and maybe she went out to get some marijuana, and, you know, the rest is history. So, initially, he's doing everything in his power to direct the investigation away from himself. And when you tell the police these things, the police have an obligation to investigate every angle. So from the very beginning, defendant Robert Bashara was focusing attention away from himself. But he knew exactly what happened to his wife. He knew because he set the whole thing in motion behind the scenes. You're going to hear that in the months before his wife's murder, actually in December of 2011, less than a month before his wife was murdered, he told 2 separate people that this was going to be the last Christmas I ever spend with my wife in that house on Middlesex. Not one, he told 2 separate people that a month before she was murdered. Additionally, you're going to hear that in the months leading up to Jane Bashara's murder, the defendant started engaging in some very strange behavior. The defendant started approaching people, putting out feelers about finding people to do things for violence. You're going to hear as testimony that Robert Bashara had a good friend. His name was Robert Goddard. Robert Goddard has known Mr. Bashara for over 20 years. He's a friend of Mr. Bashara's, and he has no reason whatsoever, you'll hear from the evidence, to lie on this man. The evidence will tell you that in the late summer of 2011, at a businessman's lunch with Robert Goddard, he just said, you know, Robert, do you know anybody who could rough up a tenant for money? Goddard looked at him kind of strange. He said, rough up a tenant for money. And he said, I need somebody to put the hurt on somebody. Now, Goddard didn't know what he was talking about. Goddard didn't care what he was talking about. He just said no. But he did say that the defendant looked, he had a funny look when he said it, when he appeared to be serious. You're also going to hear that in fall of 2011, the defendant approached another person, a separate person, and asked, did that person know of anybody who could do a hit and run for money? That person is Steve Tabata. He's known the defendant for several years. And basically he told the defendant no. You're going to also hear testimony from a third person, a Janet Lehman, that a week before the murder, she was on the phone with the defendant, and the defendant asked her, because he had been joking previously about knowing people who did that kind of thing, he asked her, hey, do you know anybody who roughed up some tenants of mine for money? That was a week before the murder. Now, what's interesting about all this testimony about the defendant in the months and the weeks before his wife's murder, setting up or asking for somebody to do violence for money, these three people don't know each other. Never met each other a day in their life, but each person tells a remarkably similar story about the defendant seeking out a person to do violence for money in the weeks and the months before his wife's murder. The defendant was obviously looking for somebody to do violence, and he found that person when he found Joseph Gintz. The evidence is going to show you that in roughly September of 2011, the defendant and Gintz got together, and you're going to get a very unique insight into their relationship and how they related to each other through the testimony of Rebecca Fortin. Rebecca Fortin will indicate to you that she met both the defendant and Joe in October of 2011 when they both showed up to rent an apartment from her. She will indicate to you that the defendant was in charge from the very beginning. He was in control. The defendant was the one who called her and said, I have somebody who wants to rent an apartment, a single father. He'll be a good tenant for you. When the defendant showed up, Joe was there. He said, hey, I will personally vouch for this man's character. He's a good guy. He is in the middle of a custody dispute. He needs a good place, nice apartment to rent so he can bring his daughter to live with him. She will indicate to you that the defendant handled the money, he handled the paperwork, and she will say when she tried to talk to Joe, the defendant interjected and was doing all the talking to Joe. She will tell you that under that whole thing when they were there, the defendant was controlling Joe. What's also interesting about this encounter is everything that the defendant needed to learn about Joe to exploit his unique vulnerabilities was there. He knew Joe needed a place to live. He knew Joe was in a custody dispute, needed a place to get his daughter. He also knew from looking at the rental application Joe's lack of income. All these things he knew to exploit and play on to gain Joe's trust and gratitude. But even further, the evidence would show there was something else that he could exploit to his advantage, and that was Joe's lack of intelligence. Rebecca Fortin will tell you that she has now she's in law enforcement, but before she was in law enforcement, she had a unique specialty of dealing with people with mental disabilities. She will tell you that Joe, when he presented to her, he presented as a person with very low IQ, and she thought he had either suffered from a closed head injury or suffered from a stroke. That's how intellectually challenged Joe was. But at the end of the day, she thought the interaction was odd, but she needed a tenant, and she rented to Joe. And the defendant took control of that situation. He brought Joe back. He filled out the receipt. He gave money. He was in control. And the evidence is going to show that that control that the defendant exerted on Joe continued in the months leading up to his death and ultimately culminated with him conspiring with Joe to kill his wife and him soliciting Joe to kill his wife. Now, make no mistake about this. Joe did the physical act of killing Jane. And DNA will prove that. But he did it under the direction and control of the defendant. Now, after Jane had been killed, something unusual happened. 1 week after Jane was killed, Vince shows up at the police station at 3 o'clock in the morning. Joe turns himself in. Joe wants a safe place to be because there's evidence that Joe was in fear of his life. Joe would rather go to the police at 3 in the morning and get himself locked up than to be walking free on the same streets as the defendant, Robert Bashara. Now, almost immediately, the evidence is going to show that the defendant went into panic mode. Defendant Bashara was worried about what Joe was saying. What is Joe going to say? What Joe might say? What Joe shouldn't say? And his friends will tell you, Mr. Bashara's friends, Defendant Bashara's friends will tell him, he was really worried about what Joe was saying. One of Mr. Bashara's friends will indicate that when the police were out trying to corroborate Joe's story and they found the Cadillac that was on Mr. Bashara's, one of Mr. Bashara's rental properties, defendant lost it. Can you believe they believe that idiot over me? That retard, they're going to take that retard word over mine? These are the words of the defendant. Because after all, the defendant is a Rotary member, an upstanding member of the community. How dare them take the word of a retard over him? But it worried him. And that worry about what Joe was saying, that worry about whether Joe was going to cut a deal to testify against him, reached a fever pitch in June of 2012. Because in June of 2012, Joe had already been charged. You're going to hear evidence that he was going through competency evaluations. And you're going to hear evidence that the defendant was worried about if he was found competent, would Joe cut a deal? And then you're going to hear what the defendant did next. And this evidence that you will hear will be crucial because it will show you the way the defendant thinks, it will show you his intent, and it will show you, more importantly, his modus operandi, his MO, his plan, his scheme of doing things. When he was worried in June about Joe cutting the deal, what did he do? He goes to Steve Tabato and tells Steve Tabato, I got to get rid of him. He's going to cut a deal against me. Steve Tabato, who doesn't know, is cooperating with the police. Steve Tabato was running a wire. And over the course of several days, not just one day, this is not a situation where he went to Steve Tabato on one day and said, hey, I want to kill Hintz. Then he went home and said, what am I doing? An innocent man wouldn't be doing this. What am I doing? I shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't be taking a human life. That didn't happen. You will hear that over the course of, I think it was 5 days. 5 days. He maneuvered and called and talked to Steve Tabato. You will hear that he went to the bank and got money and showed up and put the money on the table. And you will hear on the tape the money being counted out. As he's putting the dollars on the table, Joe got to be killed in the Wayne County Jail. Well, since Tabato was wearing a wire, it's all caught on tape, the defendant is arrested. And when the defendant is arrested, what does he do? Despite the evidence against him, despite ample evidence of his modus operandi that he sets things up behind the scenes so he can stand back. He's the puppet master that sets things in order. He starts telling all his friends and family, I didn't do it. I'm innocent. I did not do it. He came to court on the solicitation case had a not guilty plea entered for him. I didn't do it. He's talking to his friends and family. He talks to one friend on the telephone. He said, well, they said our proposition to have Gibbs killed, as if he didn't do it. His cousin, after she had heard his voice on tape setting up the hit, asked him, Bob, why did you do it? Now, he didn't say at that point, I did it because I wanted to avenge the death of my wife. He didn't say at that point, I did it because I was grief-stricken. You know what he wanted to know what he said about the act of hiring somebody to kill another human being? He simply said, it is what it is. That's what he said. And you'll hear about that, and you will hear the jail call as it relates to that. Now, finally, after it was all said and done, after he could deny it no longer, he came into court and he offered to plead guilty to killing Gibbs.
After meeting and consulting with my attorney, we have decided to read the following statement. In June of 2012, I foolishly and regrettably offered to pay Steve Tabaro to find someone to kill Joseph Gentz. This took place in Wayne County.
Wow. You set up a hit on somebody, and all you can say is, I foolishly did this. Well, the evidence is going to show that he was foolish indeed to have done that, because even after he had silenced Joe Gentz by killing him, guess what? The case could go forward because evidence was there. There was independent evidence of Joe Gentz, of the defendant's guilt. We'll first start with, you're going to hear testimony from Paul Monroe. Paul Monroe was an associate of the defendant. Paul Monroe was meeting with the defendant during the same point in time he was setting up the hit on Gentz. You're going to hear Monroe say the defendant seemed stressed out. He was just out of it. You're going to also hear from Tabaro that during that time the defendant looked like he was walking around like a zombie. He was so stressed out. And when he was with Monroe, the defendant broke down and started crying and said, yes, he did in fact hire Gentz to kill Jane. And he said he did it because divorcing Jane would be like losing money. So irrespective if he had killed Gentz and he had silenced Gentz forever, he did admit to somebody else that he did it. Now, what's interesting about the testimony of Paul Monroe, you're going to hear something else about Paul Monroe. Earlier in my statement to you, I talked about the defendant directing the attention away from him. Earlier in this case, the defendant had approached Paul Monroe, and even in June of 2012, he was asking Paul Monroe to go to the police and say somebody else was involved in the case. So when Paul Monroe was his friend, he's going to be credible, but I expect the evidence is going to show that when Paul Monroe finally comes to court and tells what the defendant said, now he's going to be all kinds of liars and everything else. Evaluate that. There's also independent evidence of the defendant's connection and conspiracy to kill Jane with Joe Gentz through phone records. See, there's one thing about today, they call them smartphones. They really are smartphones. Because today, your phone can tell you, your phone knows more about you than you know about yourself. With today's technology, with phones and cell phones, it's not a question of if you get caught, but when. And that's exactly the case with the cell phone showing the connection and conspiracy between Joseph Gentz and the defendant. The evidence is going to show through the phone records they met in late September. And from September until the time of Jane's death, between the two of them, there were 472 phone contacts. And you'll see the pattern of the phone contacts. In January, the murder month, there were over 100 phone contacts between the defendant and Joseph Gintz. And you will see that in the month of the murder, the young kids said they were blowing up his phone. The defendant was blowing up Joseph Gintz's phone the month of the murder. And nothing can be clearer than when you look at the phone pattern of calling the weekend before the murder. The weekend before the murder, you start with the 21st. The defendant calls Gintz twice. Gintz calls him once. The 22nd, the defendant calls Gintz 4 times. Gintz never calls him back. Well, apparently, the day before the murder, the defendant really wants to get in touch with Joseph Gintz. Because the day before the murder, he calls Joseph Gintz a total of 22 times. 22 times. What's interesting about this is the first call the defendant makes in the morning from his cell phone the day before the murder is to Joseph Gintz. The last call the defendant makes at night the day before the murder is to Joseph Gintz. Now, you've heard testimony. I mean, you're going to hear testimony about Gintz's intellectual capabilities. The defendant is not calling him so they can discuss Einstein's theory of relativity. Now we go to the actual day of the murder. The defendant calls Gintz 5 times, but today, Gintz finally returns the defendant's phone call. And once again, just like the day before, the first call in the morning that the defendant makes when he gets out of bed, very first call, is to Joseph Gintz. But look what happens. Look, something interesting happens. The day that the body is found, he stops calling Joseph Gintz. Doesn't call Gintz at all, but Gintz calls him. Then, the very next day, the 26th, at 10-something in the morning, Nancy Bashara, defendant's mother, her cell phone contacts Joseph Gintz. Now, this is the first time throughout their whole interaction that Gintz is contacted by another cell phone. And the evidence will show that it was the defendant who made that call, because Nancy Bashara will tell you, I don't know Joseph Gintz. I don't know Joseph Gintz's phone number. I never called Joseph Gintz. But the evidence will show, and you can infer that it was the defendant who made that phone call, because after that phone call to Joseph Gintz, defendant goes to Joseph Gintz's job and leaves a check for him. Now, this is really interesting because during this intense period of mourning, this is the same day as the candlelight vigil, where he is in his tense mourning. I lost my girlfriend, my wife, my partner. His son and daughter have lost a mother. A lot's going on. He got to plan a funeral, but throughout all that grief-stricken time, he takes the time to go deliver a check to Joseph Gintz. And the evidence is going to show, you'll see that the investigators did their homework on this. They got bank records. The evidence will show that Joseph Gintz never had any money whatsoever. His bank balance was in the below category. But the day after the murder, he has cash he's flashing around. The evidence is going to show that he had hundreds of dollars and he had enough money to buy a new cell phone, and they found the evidence of the new cell phone when they did a search warrant on his apartment. So we already got 2 independent grounds. The statement to Paul Monroe that he did it, and then we got the phone record saying he did it. What else do we have as independent evidence? Once again, it was foolish indeed for the defendant to try to silence Joseph Gintz, because another source of independent evidence are the people that Gintz talked to during the months leading up to the time. See, defendant didn't know what Gintz was doing. He asked Gintz to help him arrange this killing, and Gintz in turn turned to his friend and said, hey, look, we have an opportunity to make some fast money. You want to help me do this? So, and October and November of 2011, two friends of Joseph Gibson say Gibson approached them and asked them, hey, do you want to make some money by doing a hit and run on somebody? You will hear that from Steve Pagano. And what's interesting about this language about doing a hit and run, this is exactly the same language the defendant had asked Tabato himself earlier. He also asked Vergona to help him do a carjacking, and we know the defendant talked about having it look like a carjacking. And he talked to Gregory Baracco and also asked Gregory Baracco, would you help me do a hit and run on the car for this Bob guy is on his lady from Grosse Pointe. She drives a luxury SUV. Another independent source of the defendant's guilt comes from the body of Jane Bashara herself. When she was killed, her injuries caused massive internal bleeding, but there was some minimal external bleeding, and that bloodshed happened in the garage of the defendant's house on Middlesex. There was a drop of blood that was so small you can't see it with the naked eye, but the text used some of that luminol stuff to illuminate that blood. And in that one blood drop, the one blood drop from Jane Bashara, there was a mixture of three people's DNA. And that one blood drop contained a mixture. It contained DNA from Jane. It contained DNA from the defendant. And it also contained DNA from a third person. And the third person they were not able to identify because there was not enough genetic material in that blood sample. So in that one blood drop of Jane Bashara, the defendant's DNA is intermingled. The evidence will also show that there is some blood on the inside door of the garage belonging to Jane Bashara. That blood likewise shows that the garage door was closed when the blood got on it. The last category of evidence as it relates to the defendant's guilt that's independent of Joe Gintz is the actions and the words and the conduct of the defendant himself. You're going to hear eventually that this is called consciousness of guilt evidence. And consciousness of guilt evidence can be taken by you as circumstantial evidence of guilt. You've already seen one form of consciousness of guilt evidence in his attempt to kill Gintz, because the law says you can take that to mean he killed Gintz to help him get away with the crime of Jane. But the acts and the words of the defendant show you his guilt. Well, first of all, there are the changing stories about the defendant's alibi. Because from the very beginning, the defendant said he had an alibi. He said from about 4:30 to 8 o'clock, I wasn't at home. Well, you're also going to hear that later, that when the defendant started hearing news stories that somebody had seen him back at the house around 6 o'clock, he started telling people, oh yeah, I did have to go back to my house to get some keys. So he told that one story, and he told another person, another friend of his, that I went various places during that time. So you got the changing stories about his alibi. And let me tell you one thing about an alibi. You will hear from this case that the defendant sets up false alibis. And you'll hear about that later. There's also the changing story of, did Jane Bashara ever meet Joe? Now, you would think that he would know whether his wife ever met the man who killed him. Because after all, his story is, oh, he was a handyman for me, he did work for me. But the defendant couldn't even get his story straight on whether Jane actually met Joe.
Did you ever come to your house, Bob?
One time, to do some work in the backyard.
When did he come to your house to do work in the backyard?
1st of January, first week in January.
Did Joe ever meet Jane?
I don't know. Not at that time, no.
No, he was doing work in the backyard with Jane.
No, it was during the day. She was at work.
So, Joe never meets Jane. She was at work. Joe was in the back doing work. No, Jane, they never met. Then later, when he's talking to somebody else, he says this.
He did some yard work out back. He had met Jane out in the back. And she brought us iced tea one day when we were cleaning up shrubbery and preparing the backyard for the winter.
Okay, now, the evidence is, first he said he comes over one time in January. They don't meet. Now the next story is she comes over, he's cleaning up for the winter, and she gives us iced tea. He's telling different stories about Joe's interaction with Jane. But more importantly, the consciousness of evidence, the consciousness of guilt evidence in the defendant's words, actions, and conduct also result in other crimes. And those are the crimes that the judge told you about: obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and subordination of perjury. The first concrete example of the defendant's obstruction of justice deals with a gun. The evidence is going to show...
Your Honor, may we approach on the gun, please?
Yes, thank you. My clock stopped.
This is opening statement, and this is what the people as well as defense believe the evidence will show. The court is going to indicate based on the sidebar at hand that the opening statement regarding this gun be severely curtailed at this point in time because the court needs to make a ruling on that. But I'm going to allow you some latitude.
Thank you, Judge.
The evidence is going to show that defendant believed that Joe had said had been forced to do it at gunpoint. This was the belief of Joe. This was the belief of the defendant. This was the belief in his head. So it doesn't even matter if Joe actually said it, but the defendant, he believed that Joe said, I did it at gunpoint. So based on the defendant's belief that Joe said that, he did a media campaign with everybody saying, I never owned a gun, told friends and family members. Can you believe what that retard is saying? Can you believe what that idiot is saying? This is what the defendant believed. And based on what he thought, he reacted. He went on TV, local, national, everything, and started talking about how he didn't have a gun and how Joe was deranged.
One of the stories Joe is reportedly telling is that you forced him to kill Jane.
I don't know the firearm, and I absolutely had nothing to do with this. That is a sick assessment on his part. It just shows how deranged he is.
It shows how deranged Joe is. I believe he's saying I had a gun, but even if he said it, don't believe Joe. He's deranged. He's crazy. I don't even own a firearm. I never had a firearm. Well, the evidence is going to show that in February of 2012, during the same period of time where the defendant believed Joe was saying these things, he tricked his mother into hiding a gun in her safe deposit box, the safe deposit box that they shared. And eventually, that evidence came to light, and the police recovered that gun from the defendant's lawyer's office. You're also going to hear testimony the defendant called somebody and asked that person to hide a witness out of state from the courts. You're going to hear testimony that he told several people not to tell the police about certain things of his private life. You're also going to hear one incident about a witness named Will Schatz. And he will tell you how he was threatened and intimidated not to talk to the police. What's interesting about Will Schatz is he is the person who lived at one of Mr. Bashara's apartment complexes. And when he had heard the media coverage about a Cadillac possibly being involved, he called in an anonymous tip to the police and said, the Cadillac is here. You will hear the defendant did certain things to retaliate against Mr. Schatz. One of the things he did to retaliate and intimidate him is he used another person, Thomas Ramsey, another handyman of his, to intimidate Will Schatz. And what's interesting about Thomas Ramsey, the evidence is going to show the tables turned on Thomas Ramsey. At one point, he was working for the defendant, helping intimidate people, but at some point, Thomas Ramsey started cooperating with the police, and at that point, the defendant, now instead of being Bashara's intimidator, he is now Bashara's intimidatee. We have gone through all the independent sources of the evidence, and now I'd like to take you briefly through the investigation and how that evidence has led us here today. The car is found. Now, the first thing about the vehicle being found, and the first thing you know as an investigator is, that's a nice car. That's a bad area. Car's still, the tire's still there, airbag's still there, radio's still there. Theft, random theft, random robbery, not a motive. Then you go to the front seat of the car. Look at the front seat of the car. There is evidence of staging. The purse is thrown, purse is open, things are all askew, but you will notice there's a checkbook there, that's valuable. There's a random street robbery, that would have been gone. In that purse, there was debit cards, credit cards, all that kind of stuff, that's valuable. There was a random street robbery, that stuff would have been gone. There's even a cell phone left there. We all know cell phones are valuable. Random street robbery, random carjacking, that would have been gone. So the whole, oh, it's a random carjacking, that was just a ruse. Now, when you go to the back seat, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I forgot. The evidence of the car will also give us evidence in this case because that steering wheel was swabbed, and on that steering wheel there was DNA of Joseph Dennis. Thank you, Mr. Scott. Now, when you go to the body in the back seat, it is clear there's evidence of staging. It is clear from the body in the back seat. Anybody who looks at this can tell that the victim was moved into the car and moved to this site. First of all, she doesn't have any shoes on. There's a leaf on her sock, but her shoes are thrown into the car. That shows that from the original site, the person did not want to leave evidence in the original site. Next. The hood. That hood is not attached to the coat, and clearly you can see it is placed in the car after the body is placed in the car. That is evidence to show that the original kill site, the evidence was moved from the original to this kill site. Now, when you look at this picture, it's clear. Can I have a close-up, please? It's clear that that coat was placed on her hands like that. That was dressed on her after she was dead, because a living person does not put on their coat like that. That is to give the appearance that she was out, maybe doing a running an errand, and was carjacked. Her hands also give evidence in this case, and that on her hands there was found the DNA belonging to Joseph Dennis. Now, the cause and manner of this death of this case is very important in how you look at it. It's a violent crime, but the medical examiner will tell you that all the major trauma was concentrated and focused from the neck up. This evidence will suggest that the person who killed her did not kill her with wild abandon in some type of out of control rage. That evidence suggests that it was concentrated and focused for the purpose of taking her life. Now, after the police make these initial observations at the scene, the medical examiner is doing his thing, then of course you want to talk to the defendant. And the defendant did come forward and give a statement. And in his statement he said, "Oh, I'm happily married to my wife. We've been happily married for 26 years. We don't have any major marital problems." He didn't say they had any marital infidelities. He didn't say she was having an affair. He didn't say I was having an affair. He said, well, you know, we had minor issues over finances, but who doesn't? He just essentially painted the picture of what it was. And more importantly, when he talked to the police initially on the 26th, he did not say anybody had been threatening him. He didn't say anybody had been harassing him. He didn't say Joe Gintz has been calling me, hounding me. He didn't say Joe Gintz has been threatening my life. Matter of fact, he didn't mention the name Joe Gintz at all when he first talked to the police. The only thing the police walked away with after they talked to him on the 26th is he had no clue as to what happened to his life. Okay? He gave his whereabouts that day, but he left out a very important thing in his alibi about what he had done that day, and we'll get to that later. The defendant told the police that he had cooperated.
They have a job to do, and I want to help them find whoever did this to my wife. So I fully cooperated with them.
But he didn't cooperate with them. You're going to hear testimony that he had a relationship with Rachel Gillette, and that Rachel Gillette relationship focused on a whole nother side of him, an alternative lifestyle side. It had to do with bondage, discipline, and sadomasochism, and it was a lifestyle that he wanted to keep hidden from his wife.
Did Jane know about the alternative lifestyle?
No. You try to keep things private, not to embarrass anyone.
And quickly, you will see through the years the defendant had a serious relationship with Ms. Gillette, and this relationship was the motive for the crime. You will hear defendant's words, "Damn it, I love you, and I don't want to lose you ever. My relationship with her is over. No sex, no feeling. Hell, she says she is not happy and wants to part, so we are working on a plan. I will not let you go. You are collared to me, and I want you, period. Hello and good morning, my slave. I can't imagine and will not do so a life without you, plain and simple. No one has ever given me the care and love that you have. I am ready to make a life-changing event for you and for us. A life-changing event." He tells her he would rather live in a one-room house and be happy as long as you're with me. Finally, as to the income I will be missing, oh well, again, I would rather be poor and happy than rich and not so. I will lay out our future together. The income I will be missing. The income he will be missing was his wife, because the evidence is going to show that Jane Bashara was the breadwinner in that family. She earned all the money. So he just couldn't simply walk away from the income he would be missing.
She has income from Kima. She gets a retirement check from Detroit Edison. She retired there after 25 years. And I think she just gets one check from there.
And she has no other side ventures like herself?
No. She has a huge good-sized 401k that she's gotten from Edison. She worked there 25 years, and they did a 15% matching, so that's pretty good size. But I don't think she can access that. I think it's a 401k. You take money out and you get penalized.
Yeah.
So I think she has enough income from her income. I mean, she makes about $90,000 or $80,000 with chemo. Yeah, she's got a great job there. When she retired from Edison, she was making $110,000.
The defendant wasn't making anyone where near that. The defendant, you will hear testimony that if he cleared $20,000, $30,000 a year, he was doing good. But he still was going to go forward with his plan to be with Rachel. What I have promised you for the past year is about to be real. And you have put up with my living situation. Now that our life together will be different. Not having her in my house and the need to hide and lie will be a huge rock. A rock I am lifting now. A rock I am lifting now. That email to Rachel Gillette happened in July of 2011. In August of 2011 is when he made his first approach to a witness to have somebody do harm for money. The evidence is going to show in 2011, defendant and Rachel went on house hunting. They had plans to buy a house that they were going to bring another slave to live in their BDSM fantasy. And lastly, you're going to hear that in the days leading up to the murder, Rachel Gillette on January 20th, 2012, told the defendant that if she did not see his divorce papers, because he had told Rachel that he had been divorced, told Rachel, if I don't see the divorce, Rachel told him, I don't see the divorce papers, it's over between us. And 4 days later, Jane is dead. Jane Bashara was more than just the income he would be missing. She was a wife, a mother, a sister, and a friend. Defendant wanted a new life, a life that did not include Jane. And based on the evidence, the law, and your common sense, based on that, you will find the defendant is guilty. Thank you, Your Honor.
Very good. Thank you so much. Let's take a 10-minute recess. All rise for the jury. All rise for the jury. I'd like you to go back to the jury room at this time.